in the absence of, let's say, a paper of record and the scientific equivalent, we are left with a sense-making problem that is extremely fraught. And so when one person, especially one evolutionary thinker, looks at something said by another evolutionary thinker and leaps to the conclusion that something might be off to the point of mentally dysfunctional, that's significant to me. And so, frankly, Robert, you pissed me off, right? Because in my opinion, the bar I have to clear here isn't a very high one. Am I sane? Yeah, you'll find out that I'm sane. Not only that, but you will find out that the hypothesis I advanced, if you look at what I actually said, is well within the rational range in light of the highly unusual historical moment that we seem to be living in. And I will point out that you imposed something on what I said that wasn't there. What's more, I did say, I know how this sounds before I said what it is that you inferred I might be mentally off from. So let me put the puzzle in the context in which I believe it belongs. We have a political apparatus that is behaving in an utterly mysterious way. If you look at the policy surrounding COVID, its prevention, and its treatment, what we got from all of the official medical and epidemiological institutions was pretty close to the inverse of the advice we should have gotten. That is to say, you would have been vastly better off if you did the opposite of what you were told than if you did what you were told.
Right. That's your view. Yeah. I'm very familiar with your view, and I suspect your listeners are, but go ahead if you want to elaborate.
Well, what I want to say is, look, let's just agree that whether that view is right or wrong, if it is correct, it is not consistent with a normal explanation like incompetence. An incompetent authority would have come up with a garbage set of recommendations. They wouldn't have come up with the inverse of good recommendations. That is an unlikely place to have landed, right? It's like accidentally assembling a car.
Yeah, that's the kind of thing you said in the podcast we're talking about. So can I respond to that?
Please.
Now, first of all, I'd say, you mentioned the environment we're speaking in and what the standards should be that prevail. I personally believe something that you may not subscribe to, but it is that, especially in this environment, given how incendiary it is, if you're going to suggest that the executive branch, the Biden White House, and for reasons we'll get to, that's what I took you to be saying. I'll quote the things you said, but if you're going to suggest that the Biden administration or powerful people in there are enemies of the state, which I think you did, I would say that in the current environment, maybe your standards of evidence should be a little higher than for the average hypothesis you just throw out there because it occurs to you. And I'm going to argue that this is not your hypothesis. There are a number of hypotheses that are stronger than yours to explain what you've seen that seem to have escaped your attention. And this is what I mean by motivated reasoning. And again, we all do it. I'm just saying you did it.
I don't think I did it because I don't think you've understood my hypothesis.
Well, fine. Can I go ahead and say what I want to say?
Sure.
Okay. You haven't even heard what I'm saying. All you've seen is one tweet.
Well, no, I've just heard what you've said about my position, and it isn't my position.
Let me read what you said.
Okay.
And I just want to ask whether it is or is not the case that, especially in the environment we're in, a number of people would take this to be a serious suggestion that there is some kind of conspiracy in the executive branch which is run by Democrats, to undermine the military readiness of our country. So here's what you said. Now, this was a podcast featuring several people from the armed services who did not want to get vaccinated, and they were talking about the toll of the mandatory vaccine policy. Some people get sidelined because they refuse to get vaccinated and so on, and that was a big part of the toll, I guess. I think
sidelined. We've had people discharged from the military dishonorably. We've had a court martial. We're talking about something beyond just being slighted.
Right. I just meant you mean there's been a loss of manpower.
There's been a loss of manpower and a crippling decline in morale, understandably.
Okay, now this is your view, and I kind of get the idea that you often, when you're trying to figure out what the motivation for like a policy may be, you assume everyone shares important parts of your view, and I assure you that what you just said is not necessarily shared by everyone, right? That there is you have talked to a series of people in the military who share the view. The reason they're on your podcast is because they share your view, but I doubt that Joe Biden spends a lot of time with these kinds of people. Now, you may say that leaves him like deluded or something, but I suspect it's the case. And if his perspective is different from yours, I think that needs to be taken into account. So can I get to what you actually said?
Please.
Okay. Here, a few things. You're right. The policies that are so devastating here are being advanced most aggressively by what I call the blue team, the Democratic Party, of which I've been a lifelong member, but I can't even recognize that party now. So if you were interested in keeping that party in power so that it could continue to advance bad policy, but you were also interested in degrading military readiness, then the mandates might persist in the military while they were withdrawn in advance of midterm elections or something like that in the civilian population. I hear myself saying that, and I know how it sounds. On the other hand, I'm a scientist. What I do is I look at patterns and I eliminate potential explanations based on the fact that they don't fit until we're down to a small number of explanations that might underlie the pattern. And in this case, that is a very unfortunate process that I think ought to alarm every American. So you seem to think this is the most parsimonious explanation or close to that. A few other things you said in the course of the same podcast. Has something gotten into our system that is unhooking our readiness because it doesn't want us ready? Here's another thing. It's hard to explain that pattern by anything other than some form of sabotage. Here's another thing. We're looking at something that behaves like enemy action. Now, I submit that anyone who listens to this podcast and is already inclined to not be big fans of the Biden administration, specifically with respect to this issue, and I suspect that description fits a fair number of people in your audience, could take you as suggesting that, in fact, there is a conspiracy in the executive branch to undermine our military readiness. You don't think so?
I know exactly what error you're making.
What is it called?
Let me ask you a question. Do you believe that our system has a problem with corruption?
Most systems have some kind of problem with corruption.
I would agree. I'm a fan of were you a fan of The Wire?
I didn't watch it, no.
It was excellent. And there was a particular scene in which an individual involved in city government was talking to another individual walking down the street, and their point was, you have to expect a certain amount of corruption, but the level of corruption has become obscene. And that is where we are. I do not expect a system without any corruption. But the level of corruption in our system, I would argue, is utterly obscene. Does that sound like a crazy position to you so far?
Well, you'd have to define terms. My main point is that there are other explanations for the phenomenon you're describing that are much less incendiary and actually more plausible.
You have laid out your case. I
haven't. I haven't gotten to the other explanations.
You have laid out your case that what I'm saying is beyond the pale. Now,
you're not going to let me get to the alternative explanations, Bret? Is this a scientific discussion?
You seem a little defensive, Robert. We are having a conversation. You have said some things. I would like to respond to them because I think you so far haven't even understood what it was that I was putting on the table.
Okay, what were you putting on the table?
I believe we have a problem with obscene levels of corruption in our system. I believe that COVID policy reveals this. Now, if you want a little historical background, I would say that before the Clinton administration, the GOP was the party of business, that it had a business model in which effectively it peddled influence to wealthy, mostly corporations, when those corporations wanted to do something that was not in the interest of the public, right? And there's a natural tension between these things. You tend to pay in order to influence things when what you're doing is not in the interest of those who are being governed, because you wouldn't have to pay if it was. We would just simply do it. That's what corruption is. Now, the Clinton administration, I believe, changed the Democratic Party. That what it did was it took up the GOP's business plan and it abandoned the public and started serving different corporate interests. And we effectively ended up with two corporate parties and nobody representing the public. And so these parties both pay attention to the public periodically when they have to because there's an election, but by and large, what they exist for is to serve the interests of wealthy donors at the expense of the interests of the public. That's what they do 365 days a year, okay? Now, the problem is that once you have a system that is informally about corruption, there are no good safeguards for preventing things that you don't anticipate from getting into that system. And so what I was suggesting was not that Joe Biden or anyone else in the executive branch is actively interested in harming the country, but that something has purchased influence that might be.
What do you think that thing is?
Well, I don't know.
If it's not, I mean, but a limited number of people can sway our vaccine policy in the military. So either they are unwitting dupes of something, and I'm waiting to hear what you think that is, or they are intentionally implementing this policy. And I venture to say, by the way, that based on the things you said, the average naive listener would think you're suggesting, on the basis of these quotes, that there are actually conspirators in the executive branch. But if not, what scenario do you have in mind about how they become unwitting dupes and who is pulling the strings and how?
Well, let me ask you a question. I mean, it seems to me...
Why don't you ever answer my questions? And, what is the answer to that question? What do you have in mind?
First of all, Robert, there is a reason that I phrased this as a hypothesis. Now, the fact of it being a hypothesis does not mean I do or do not believe that it is the explanation. It means that it is a proposal for something that might explain a pattern, something that makes predictions, and that it deserves to be on the table of potential explanations. Okay? Now, it happens that I do think that this one is plausible, but you do not have, logically speaking, you don't have the right to try to get me to fill out the picture of how this corruption might work. I don't know.
You don't have to state what your hypothesis is. I took it to be that there's somebody in the executive branch corrupting our policy intentionally. You're saying, no, I didn't mean that. Well, then what did you mean? What is your hypothesis?
Let me then look, we are going to get to the approximate answer to your question. Do you think we have enemies who would consider attacking us militarily?
Sure.
Okay. Do you think we have enemies that would contemplate sabotage against us rather than attacking us militarily?
Sure.
Do you think they have noticed that we have a pay-for-play political system? And do you think they have contemplated paying to get us to do things that they would have a hard time doing from the outside?
Well, I know for a fact that foreign interests, as well as a number of domestic special interests that are also corrupting, make donations to politicians. They also try to influence think tanks. Okay. There's a lot of corruption of clear thinking out there. Sure.
Then what are we disagreeing about?
I just want to hear what your actual hypothesis is. You told me I was wrong. You are not even suggesting that Joe Biden or anyone in the administration is intentionally undermining our military readiness. So, okay, who is and how are they pulling these strings? Because it's not that easy to manipulate a policy like this. So what do you have in mind?
Again, I'm not sure why you feel entitled to demand of me particulars that I, of course, have no way of knowing. The question is, are there powers out there that have a large quantity of financial capacity, who might have noticed that we have a system in which you can pay for play, who might be feeding something into it that isn't good for us? And that the people who are going along with this are not actively interested in harming us, but they don't give a shit about us. That's why they're in this pay-for-play system.
You mean there are American actors who don't want to harm us but don't give a shit, so they're being bribed or something?
Look, I was attacked for simply paying attention to the Hunter Biden laptop story during the last presidential election. Now, it turns out the laptop was what it appeared to be, and it obviously doesn't, make it an open and shut case with respect to Joe Biden's corruption, but it is certainly suggestive. The things that Hunter Biden said, his presence in Ukraine, in a field where he was not expert, making lots of money, is certainly suggestive that what we have is an administration with an influence peddling problem. Now, the question is, do we believe that influence peddlers have some sort of code that they live by, where they will peddle influence to certain people, but certainly not other people? They will sell us out to some, but not others. Now, I would guess there's something like that, but I don't know what the code is. And so when I see an obvious pattern of the degradation of military readiness, and I say, does the military know that it is degrading its own readiness? How is it conceivable that it is okay with degrading its own readiness? Why would you take pilots in whom you've invested millions of dollars in training and sideline them? This is a dangerous world. We build those aircraft for a reason. We train those pilots for a reason. Why would you sideline them over a vaccine that does not prevent transmission of a disease and that is not necessary for a young person who is fit enough to be a fighter pilot?